morning. Shabbat Shalom. Hope everybody's doing well this morning. The weather's really pretty. He beat me to it. My weather report of the week. The weather's really great. It is really great. The weather's good. I'm glad to be here. We're going to continue our series, and I guess it's going to be a long one. I looked this morning again. I'm like, I forgot there were that many chapters in Nehemiah, but we'll keep going because it's good. Just to recap last week, we have a situation where Nehemiah is visited by his brother, and his brother says, he has the insight to ask, how's it going? What's going on back home? And his brother says, it's actually really bad. The walls have been destroyed, the gates are burned down, and it's not good. It's not good at all. And Nehemiah's first response is to go to God in prayer. And we talked about his prayer and how he approached God through honor and glory and giving him all the glory for everything that he's done, like we see many times throughout Scripture. And then the very last place in the prayer that he is praying, he gives his petition, which is that God would give him favor that day with his boss, basically, the king, that he would give him favor that day whenever he goes and tries to address him about the situation going on. Seems like a menial request, this is a guy who trusts him, who trusts Nehemiah with his life for the protection of his life, but he's asking for favor. I think that it's a really good story here as we get started about how we can kind of approach life. How do we approach difficult situations, and how do we approach situations that can seem daunting to us, or I could even say the word scary to us. I spent the later half of this week at a conference in Chicago, and I was in one of the sessions, and they were talking about basically the climate of their colleges, what it's like. And so many people were saying, they're scared to speak up, they're scared to say anything, they're scared, there's no trust, and they feel like they can't have a voice in all of this. And I get it, I understand it. But at the same time, as believers, we can speak in confidence, even when we're scared because of who we are in God. And I think that's the message as we go forward in chapter 2 today, that even when we face times where it feels like, man, I can't even say a thing, we can go to God and pray, and we can have confidence in Him, and that can give us our voice even when it seems like we can't. So we're going to read this kind of in two sections. There's 20 verses here, so we're going to go through the first 10 first, and then we'll go through the last 10. So if you want to, you can open your Bibles, and as I go through the verses after we read them, I'm not going to read them again, but you can keep your Bibles open and kind of follow along. But we'll read chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. During the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was set before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had never been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, "Why do you look so sad when you aren't even sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart." I was overwhelmed with fear and replied to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should I not be sad when the city of my ancestors are buried, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Then the king asked me, "What is your request?" So I prayed to the God of the heavens and answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, send me to Judah and to the city where my ancestors are buried, so that I may rebuild it." The king, with the queen seated beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you return?" So I gave him a definite time, and it pleased the king to send me. I also said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let me have letters written to the governors of the region west of the Euphrates River, so that they will grant me safe passage until I reach Judah. And let me have a letter written to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so that he will give me timber to rebuild the gates of the temple's fortress, the city wall, and the home where I will live." The king granted my request, for the gracious hand of my God was on me. I went to the governors of the region west of the Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent officers of the infantry and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard that someone had come to pursue the prosperity of the Israelites, they were greatly displeased. So that's the first 10 verses, and it kind of, this section, this chapter really is broken into two sections, and we'll see that as we go into the next section. But we'll just start here in the beginning, here in these first few verses. It mentions a king in the first chapter, but here it mentions him by name, Artaxerxes. And this name can mean one of two people, either Artaxerxes the first or the second. And I would suggest that it's the first, since there's no designation given here, because you wouldn't, if it's King Artaxerxes the first, you don't designate the first. You don't have a designation till there's a second. But when we look at Nehemiah's approach, I think, again, it's significant. I think that it's significant to the king. Here comes the person that he's entrusted with his life, as we've mentioned so many times before, and there was this responsibility of safety of the king that Nehemiah had. And when he approached him, the king asked him a question and said, "Why do you look so sad?" The king had never seen him sad. I think there's a lesson in professionalism here on Nehemiah's part, but that's for another day. But I want to focus on this word sad, because really when we see this word elsewhere in Scripture, it's the word ra. Anybody know what the word ra means? A lot of times it's used for evil, contemptible. This is actually how Rashi, an early Jewish theologian, how he understands this, that he thinks that his face was evil with contempt, that the king actually looked at him and thought, "Have you come to kill me?" is kind of how Rashi explains it. I don't think that's necessarily the case, because it can mean bad. So he could say, "Why do you look so bad?" Some people would take offense to that. Women, imagine if your husband, you walked in the room and said, "Why do you look so bad today?" I think sad is proper in the context, because he says that, "Why do you look so sad when you aren't sick?" I think that's the closest that we can get. But what is Nehemiah's reaction to the perception of the king? It says that I was overwhelmed with fear. I was overwhelmed with fear. Notice the time that this takes place. It says in verse 1 that this is in the month of Nisan. And if you remember back into chapter 1, and you can flip back yourself and see it real quickly, chapter 1, this prayer that happens was in the month of Kislev. And depending on the year, this meant that this happens right now, 3 to 4 months after Nehemiah had first prayed to God and asked for favor. Apparently, Nehemiah had not gotten the confidence up to approach the king yet. It took the king noticing something different in Nehemiah for the topic to even be brought up. If you look in chapter 1, when he prays, the last line of his prayer, he says, "Give your servant success today and grant him compassion in the presence of this man," talking about the king. Nehemiah asked for success today, but it takes him 3 to 4 months to actually approach him. I think there's humanity in this exchange. I think there's realistic humanity in the exchange here, where a man of faith who prays one of the most beautiful prayers in the Scripture still takes 4 months to overcome his fear and to ask for what he needs. And I think this is reasonable, because approaching the king was significantly dangerous no matter what your position was. This person was entrusted with the king's life, but it didn't matter. To approach the king and to bring up something was at very great risk of your life. We see this in the story of Esther. In Esther chapter 4, it says, "All the royal officials and the people of the royal provinces know that one law applies to every man and woman who approaches the king in the inner courtyard and who has not been summoned, the death penalty." It's notable that Esther is somewhat contemporary to what's going on in Nehemiah, and the region that they're in is somewhat the same as well. We have treasury release from Persepolis in the region where this is taking place with Nehemiah, where it depicts people coming into the king's presence with their both hands over their mouth, so that not only would they'd be tempted to say a word, but that the king would not even be defiled with their breath. They covered their mouths. It's great risk for him to bring this up. Remember that King Artaxerxes had halted construction on this very project the year before. The people in the region had protested, and he said, "All right, we're going to stop all of this." And so for Nehemiah to approach him, he's actually asking him to reverse a decision that he had made the year before. And Nehemiah makes this request, but he does so in a very unique way. If you notice in his request, he never says that I want to go to Jerusalem. He never says that I have word that Jerusalem is at great danger. He never says, please send me to Jerusalem. He says, send me to the city of the graves of my fathers. He doesn't mention Jerusalem by name. He reads the room. He sees the position that the king is in. He knows that for him to even mention the word Jerusalem, the name Jerusalem, would be at great risk to the king's honor. He would essentially be saying, when he mentions Jerusalem, that the decision that the king had made was not a good one. It was not a wise one. And it would be at great disgrace to the king to say, yes, you can go fix what I caused. But he doesn't say that. He approaches him with some tact. He approaches him with some wisdom and says, please send me to the city of the graves of my father. No doubt the king knew where the graves of his father was. But he kind of gives the king an out. He kind of allows him to save face with this approach. Just recently, I was talking to someone about how to approach people. And this person said, sometimes I make people mad, and it doesn't matter. I'm going to say what I want to say. And I said, do you think that's the best approach? Well, why isn't it? I can say what I want to say, and they can say what they want to say. And I went on to kind of explain that sometimes humility has to come into play, where you have to realize that you have to set aside what you want to say for the greater good of what you think should happen, that you can approach people differently, and that's exactly what Nehemiah does here. And the king goes on, and he asks him, he says, what is your request? Nehemiah could have just jumped right into the request. He could have just said, this is exactly what I want. But what does he do first? He first prays to the God of the heavens. I thought about this. I'm like, what does this look like? You get this really tense moment where he's coming in to do his job, and he has this look on his face, and the king says, what's going on? What's the deal? And then he tells him what the deal is, and he says, what's your request? And if you're in that situation, you would think that, I would want to go ahead and say it real quick and get it out. I don't want to look like I'm wasting the king's time. But Nehemiah prays, and I just had this kind of a moment where in my mind as I'm reading this, where it's like Nehemiah's like, well, hang on just a second. And he goes over and prays and comes back. I don't think that's necessarily what happened, because we can pray continuously. Everybody can do that, right? We go through our day. We can be in the midst of a conversation that we know needs prayer, and we can be praying simultaneously while having that conversation. But imagine the point that Nehemiah is at is 3 to 4 months after his initial prayer. And it says that Nehemiah prayed daily with other people. He's been praying for 3 to 4 months for this very moment. Surely he's been praying for this moment, and yet he still saw the need to pray in the moment. That prayer undoubtedly would have given him the confidence that he needed to move forward, to really discuss what needed to be discussed, and probably was what was needed to give him the wisdom to discuss it in the way that he did. And then the king responds. Notice that the queen is sitting next to him. I always pay attention to these words, because whenever we go through, it's like it just seems thrown in there. But if we understand the times, we understand that at this time, the royal court was full of women that were very influential at the time. They had great voice and influence with the king. And she's not mentioned here, but her name is Nappier. She's mentioned elsewhere. And it just mentions that she's sitting there. I can only imagine that she had some kind of say-so in the decision that was happening. But I want you to notice the shift in the king's perception in his response. Remember that he noticed that Nehemiah's face looked sad or raw or bad or even evil. Notice that he looked at Nehemiah and saw this demeanor that he had that was not good. And here it says, it pleased the king to send me. I want you to pay close attention to this. It pleased the king to send me. It literally says here, and it was good before the face of the king. It was good before the face of the king. The king is pleased to send him. God turned what was bad. God made this bad situation and he made it into a good situation. He took this Ra and made it Tov. And this is going to be a theme that runs throughout the book of Nehemiah. But how many times do we do this and we come across this in our life where we have bad situations and we get down on ourselves, or we think about it, how bad our situation is, and it's going on and we can't get over how bad it is, only to realize later that it was good? Anybody ever been in that situation? Nobody? Okay, just me. Think about like when people leave our lives. There's a lot of people who used to sit in these chairs that aren't here. There's people who joined us in the old building that aren't here anymore. We change jobs, or we move positions at work, or maybe we have to move from one house to another or one place to another. And what do we call that? We think it's bad, or we struggle with it in the midst, but then we realize it's good. What's a phrase we call that? Anybody? A blessing in disguise, maybe? And I think that phrase is okay, but I think Nehemiah would call this God in my midst. Blessing in disguise is okay because we know blessings come from God. But I think it's stronger if we understand these moments as God being in our midst. And then Nehemiah wisely takes advantage of the king's good posture. And I think we all do this. We'll get nervous about a request. Even as children, we'll say, my kids love to say, "Oh, Dad, I want to ask you this, but I know you'll say no." But we do this in our heads sometimes when we ask people things or we approach people with stuff. And then when the response is favorable, we get a good response to what our request is, or we think that, oh man, this is great. Then we kind of double down, right? We say, well, now that we're talking, let's talk about something else. We all do this. We try to take advantage of the good situation. And he does this here. He takes advantage of God's good that's happening with the king. And Nehemiah requests letters for safe passage. And he gets to this place where he asks for letters for the governors kind of along the way, and then he asks for a letter for the keeper of the king's forest. And there's this thought that by many that this forest is the cedars of Lebanon that would be by that king, but pay attention to that this is after he gets to Judah. And I think that more appropriately, this is probably referring to Solomon's gardens or something like that, especially since the keeper of this garden has a Hebrew name, Asaph. There's a guy, and I'd never heard of this guy. I had to look him up and read up on him a little bit. Antagonius the One-Eyed. Apparently there was this guy, this military ruler. His name was Antagonius the One-Eyed. I don't know if he lost his eye in battle. I never could find it out. But in a little while after this time, he writes and says that he cut down the forest of the cedars of Lebanon, not this forest, to make naval boats. And so they were very prized possessions. But I think this is more referring to something that's there in the region of Judea. And then Nehemiah asks for provisions. He wants this wood so that he can build a guard tower, city walls, and a residence for himself as governor of the region. And we see guard towers later on attested to from this time period. Josephus and others attest to the fact that there was a guard tower on the north side of the city, and that's probably the one that this one was built. King Herod himself would build a guard tower even closer to the Temple Mount, Antonia Fortress. It's on the northwest corner. That's the place where Paul, when he's arrested, he goes and gets examined. So this fortress is very important. Its protection, its provision. And the king grants the request. And then we see how Nehemiah understands this grant. He says, "For the gracious hand of my God was on me." The gracious hand of my God was on me. If we read that literally, he says that the good hand of my God was on me. And we see this flow from Nehemiah's demeanor at the beginning of the chapter of raw, sadness, bad, maybe evil to some people. I don't think it was evil. But we see this flow to good. The king now is good. Now God's hand is good. He's again attributing the good that is coming to being from God's hand. The good hand is used throughout Ezra and Nehemiah. We'll see this many times over. And this good hand is what we would say is divine favor. This is God acting on his behalf. And the fact that there are no details to the journey, he asked for all these requests for letters, but yet we get no details of the journey, I would insist, means that the journey went off without a hitch, that God's good hand carried him through. And then at the end of this request, we see that Nehemiah has opposition. It says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard that someone had come to pursue the prosperity of the Israelites, they were greatly displeased. Like just at the initial reading of this, how absurd. How absurd that two men would be so greatly displeased that anyone would want to do good for anyone else. But I think that if we think hard enough, we could probably think of times in our lives and currently in the world where people want to do good for others, but that makes people mad. People want to do good for others, but it upsets others. When it has no bearing on them, I think we'll see at the end of this that it's really illogical that they would even have an issue. But here we have two men. Let's talk about them for a second. Sanballat the Horonite. And he's probably getting his name, the Horonite part comes from either the region he's at. There's a few possibilities. He might be from the town of Beth Horon, which is northwest of Jerusalem. He could be from Horonaim in Moab. That town is mentioned in Isaiah 15:5. He could be from a region east of the Galilee that's mentioned in Ezekiel 47. But here's what I think is more important. I think that the Horonite title more aptly addresses the syncretism that's probably in his worship. Because you see, at this time you have the Israelites who worship Yahweh, but you also have the Canaanites who worship a god named Haran. I think in that context this is likely. And maybe it's both. Maybe there's this double entendre that's happening here where both the region where he comes from and his syncretism both connect in this title. It's interesting that his name is an Akkadian name, Sin Ubalit, which means sin has called into life. Sin for us means to be rebellious to God, but sin was actually a deity's name in the region at the time. So his name actually means that this deity's sin had given him life. But then he goes on to have two children, and their names are Deliah and Shelemiah, whose names attribute glory to Yahweh. And you kind of see this syncretism. Their names are recorded in an elephantine letter to Bagoas. You kind of see this syncretism happen even in the naming of his children. And then we have Tobiah. Anybody know what Tobias in Greek, Toby in English? There we go. This guy's an official in some translations. It actually says he's an Ebed of the king. Ebed means servant. All too often, I think that Ebed, a servant of the king, is an official. But just like today, so many officials and nobles, they lose sight of the fact that they're supposed to be servants of the people. But this person, Tobiah, his name does mean God is good. God is Tov, which is already in our chapter several times. And despite the connection to Ammon, his family was very connected to Jerusalem. His family had great power around the region. But again, his son's name was Jehohanan, which means God is gracious. And so both of these have very close ties to Jerusalem. They have very close ties to the Israelite people. But despite these connections, they protested Nehemiah's efforts. It says that someone had come to, they hear this word, it says someone had come to pursue the prosperity of the Israelites. Pursue the prosperity. Some of your versions may say pursue the welfare of the Israelites. You know what word is there in prosperity or welfare, how it's translated? Anybody guess what that word is? It should be obvious by now. It's Tov. They opposed that someone came saying that someone was coming to pursue the good of the Israelites. Someone was coming to pursue the goodness of the Israelites. And then it says they were greatly displeased with this. Greatly displeased. What does that mean? They're just not happy with it. They heard about it. They're not so okay with it. If we kind of rearrange this, I kind of did my own translation here. It seemed very wrong to them that someone had come to seek the good of the Israelites. It seemed very wrong to them. This doesn't even make sense. And that's even me making a translation that flows. If I really break it down, in a very literal translation, they thought that it was evil with great evil that someone would seek good. They thought that it was Ra with great Ra that someone would seek Tov. A theme that continues to find its way into this chapter. But this should be expected, right? We should all expect this. Because when the good hand of God shows favor to his people, what should we expect except opposition from someplace? Right? Opposition sometimes is completely illogical, and I think here it makes no sense. Here the whole region seeks to benefit from what he's coming to do, but yet they would oppose it. And I think that this highlights the unstated but very likely reason they're opposing it. If he's coming in to be governor of the region and to rebuild the city, he's a threat to their own power. He's a threat to their own grasp on the people. Because there's no other reason that anyone would oppose the goodness of any people except for the oppression that is withheld in their own hands. We'll move forward and we'll read 11 through 20 here and continue looking at the situation in Jerusalem. It says, "After I arrived in Jerusalem and had been there for 3 days, I got up at night and took a few men with me. I didn't tell anyone what my God had laid on my heart to do for Jerusalem. The only animal I took was the one I was riding. I went out at night through the valley gate toward the serpent's well and the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that had been broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but farther down it became too narrow for my animal to go through. So I went up by night by the way of the valley and inspected the wall. Then heading back, I entered through the valley gate and returned. The officials did not know where I'd gone or what I was doing, for I had not yet told the Jews, priests, nobles, officials of the rest of those who would be doing the work. So I said to them, 'You see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned. Come, let us rebuild Jerusalem's wall, so that we will no longer be a disgrace.' I told them how the gracious hand of my God had been on me and what the king had said to me. They said, 'Let's start rebuilding,' and their hands were strengthened to do the good work. When Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about this, they mocked and despised us and said, 'What is this you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king?' I gave them this reply, 'The God of the heavens is the one who will grant us success. We, his servants, will start building, but you will have no share, right, or historic claim in Jerusalem.'" I think that as this opens up here, just as a side note, and I didn't look into it too much, but I do think that it's significant that he stayed 3 days and then arose at night and goes about his business. But in the plain sense of the reading, it appears that Nehemiah is laying low to assess the situation of everything that's happened in Jerusalem. Remember the spies that went into the land? That was their whole point. They were supposed to go into the land and go to the mountaintops and look down and assess the situation before they went and executed the plan of God. And here we see the same thing happening with Nehemiah. He enters the city and he kind of lays low for a few days, but he lays low because he's kind of getting his plan together. He's getting the facts, he's laying eyes on the situation, and then he can move forward with his plan. Now, the size of Jerusalem at this time is debated. It's either 220 acres or 90 acres, but I'm not sure that's too relevant. But I just bring that up to say there's no real way to know the exact path that he took, but we know kind of a general sense of where he went. So he starts on the west side of the Valley Gate, and he goes to the Dung Gate on the south side. And yes, that's dung, like waste, because this is the place and the path through the city that they took their waste out of the city and into the valley and burned it. But this is also the place that was known elsewhere as Gehenna, the place where child sacrifices had taken place in previous times. And he passes this place called the Dragon Spring. That's a much cooler word than what I thought of it. This is actually the Pool of Siloam. If you remember in the New Testament times, the Pool of Siloam. And this place was recently excavated. The last time that I was in Israel, they had started. Used to, the Pool of Siloam was about as wide as this stage and probably from here to the second row, and that's all you could see. And we were there the week they started excavations, but because of everything going on, haven't been back. But I've seen pictures. It's really awesome. They've excavated this entire pool. But you get to this pool one of two ways. You can either walk down the street, down the hills, and get to this pool, or you can take the extremely much funner way of walking through the tunnel of Hezekiah for 30 minutes. Through the water, and the water comes out there because that's what this is. Hezekiah built a tunnel, and it's kind of a serpentine shape, which is probably where we get this dragon well from, the name, and it connects the Pool of Siloam to the Gihon Spring. But here we have this movement. He goes counterclockwise around to the fountain gate, the King's Pool, and it says there that it was too narrow, his animal couldn't pass. And I would take this to mean either the debris from destruction, or there were these terraces on the east side that kept falling down, like these big terraces for gardens. David had to repair them, Solomon repaired them, Hezekiah repaired them. It could be that. But it seems that he inspected the city of David here, and not so much the Temple Mount, but that's where he goes. And then after he does all of this inspection, he takes his notes, he gathers his data. It says, then he meets with the officials. He had not even talking to them yet. He had not even told them what he was doing, but he does so after his inspection. And here I think Nehemiah again demonstrates his authority, but also a strong vision and strategic planning. And he does this with the king earlier. We talk about how you approach people differently. With the king, he waits till the king brings up the situation of his demeanor, and he capitalizes on that to be able to bring about what needs to happen. But here he goes and gathers all of his data, all of his facts, and then he presents them, the local stakeholders, with a plan. And this word officials could seem like a broad term, but the second time it's mentioned, it specifies that this is specifically the Jewish officials. These aren't non-Jewish officials. These aren't officials from the king Artaxerxes. These are people that are officials in place there locally, Israelites. But these are also the people that are throughout Ezra and Nehemiah posed in a poor light, and rightfully so, because they've allowed the destruction of the city walls, and they even protested it at one point. But it says here, when we look at Nehemiah's explanation to them of what happens, he basically says we've got to repair all these city gates and all of this thing. The gates have burned down, the wall has been destroyed. But he finishes by saying, so that there will no longer be a disgrace, which is interesting. Because as humans, we often will look at the safety and security. That's our focus above all else. We've got to be safe and secure. We've got to make sure that we're provided for and we have all we need, and then we can do what needs to be done outside of that. But here, Nehemiah seems to place the disgrace of the people as the greater concern. It's not so much that the walls have been destroyed, but that the wall's destruction brings a disgrace to the city and the people who live there. And it's not so much that it's a disgrace to the city and the people who live there, but remember, this place, Jerusalem, it's the focal point of Israel because it's the place where the temple resides, or should reside. It's the place where God's presence could be met over dinner, where people were invited to God's house. And when the temple wasn't thriving, it communicated to the rest of the world that Yahweh was powerless, that he had no ability to maintain his own house and his own people. This is a disgrace. But what does he say? He says, as any great leader would, let us rebuild Jerusalem's wall. There's a part of the old Drill Sergeant's Creed that says, I will lead by example, never requiring a soldier to attempt any task I would not do myself. I remember I was going for a different position than I'm at work now when I first was applying to Delta. And during I can't remember when, but at some point during the process of interviews, I brought up evening classes, like as a community college. I'd been asked to look and assess and see what needed to be improved on the Ruston and Jonesboro campuses, and I brought up evening classes. It seemed like we weren't doing that enough. And someone said, well, are you willing to stay with them if you do that? And I said the same thing, like, I'm not going to ask anybody I'm not willing to do, but we're missing opportunities there. but it's always great leaders who are willing to put their hand to the plow and do the work alongside them, and that's what Nehemiah does. And when he says this along with his personal testimony, the officials become excited. They get enthused, and they respond by saying that they're ready to do the work. It seems like Nehemiah's strategic planning and his leadership, but most importantly, his testimony of God, had motivated them to move forward. This comes after he tells them about, again, the good hand of God. And I think that this personal testimony is the key. And just think about how Nehemiah would have told this story. Think about how you have told stories. I hope everyone here has shared a testimony about some work that God has done in your life. We'll have time after the prayer or during the prayer, like I would encourage anyone today to give a testimony. Come up here and give a testimony of how God has interacted in your life, how you have seen the good hand of God lead you and direct you to do something in life. But imagine how he would have told the story. Imagine the things he would have said about how his brother came and gave him this word, and that his brother didn't even mention the information up front, but that he thought to ask him, and he told him, and how he trusted God. He gave God glory and prayed and did all these things, and that he prayed for favor with the king, and that, can you imagine what it took for me to go to this king and to say these things whenever my head could be on the chopping block? But I prayed again. When I got in that moment 4 months later, I prayed again, and he gave me favor, and he saw my bad demeanor and turned it to good, and how he gave me favor by sending letters, and I went through all of these passes, and he gave me protection. The king, without even asking, sent the artillery and the infantry with them, the cavalry and the infantry with them, and sent them without even being asked. Can you imagine the way that he would, with excitement, talked about how he had safety and security 500 miles all the way back to Jerusalem, how God had given him wisdom and vision to ask for him to go to the place of his father's resting place, burial sites, as opposed to mentioning the name of Jerusalem. How he had mentioned to him that he sought to seek out the plan before he brought it to their attention, and that all of that was because of God's good hand. He's speaking to people who are Israelites, who know God, who seem to have let God go by the wayside of their lives, but they're excited. Think about how you tell the stories of God, how excited you get. Think about how real believers, when you tell them these stories, they get excited too. I know when someone gives me a personal testimony of God's work, like I get pumped up. I get really excited. I want to run out the door and go do something for God right immediately. Imagine these believers who seem to have been relaxed in their faith walk. They immediately get excited after hearing about the good hand of God, and they start preparing for the work to do to the city. But just like the first half of the chapter, we see the same pattern. God's good hand is shown in his approach to the king, and then here God's good hand is shown in the approach to the officials, and in both situations opposition comes. Again, there's this pattern where when divine favor is given, we should expect opposition. And here they bring along another person, Gishom, the Arab, who's been added to their protest. This is the father of Cain, the king of Kedar. And his son would eventually unite the Arabian tribes into a vast confederation covering the entire area around the eastern and southern regions of the Dead Sea as far as the Nile Delta. This is no chump. This is no just dude on the side of the street who's saying, like, I don't really think we should do this. This is great opposition. And now he has 3 people coming to him in opposition. His son's name appears on some silver vessels that they found in the 5th century. This family's of great importance. And they couch their opposition here in the name of the king. I think it's very important. It's very important because we'll see what Nehemiah's response is, but they couch their opposition. They don't know that the king has sent him. They haven't heard the testimony of the good hand of God. And they say, like, do you seek to rebel against the king? But really, they're concerned with their own power. But as we look at Nehemiah's response, I think he shows great strength in his response. Too many times we see people that have the opportunity to respond to opposition that don't do so. And if they do, it's not in great strength. Here, it says in my translation, the CSB, it says, I gave them this reply. Literally, it says, then I sent a word to them in response. A word. To me, that sounds like I sent them a word from God himself. We don't see Nehemiah necessarily as a prophet, but that's what it sounds like to me. But he says that they will not have three things. And the reason why I think it comes from God is because these three things are gifts that God alone would be able to give them. They'll have no share, no right, and no remembrance. They'll have no share, no inheritance. We know from the story of early Israelites when they came out of exile before, when they come out of Egypt and they go to the land, God is who establishes their inheritance through Moses, through Joshua. They'll have no right. This word means that they'll have no authority over anyone in Jerusalem. And they'll have no remembrance. They'll have no legacy, something that was so important. And if I can sum up the words of Nehemiah here as he's telling them, he's basically looking them in their face and saying, you have no legitimate past, present, or future in this city. So what you say has no bearing on what we will do. But I think it's important that he doesn't even address their appeal to the king. He has documents from the king. Remember, he's brought letters to say to people that he needs safe passage because he's on a mission from King Artaxerxes. And they appeal to the king, and he doesn't even show them to him. What does he do instead? He appeals to them from a religious posture. The three gifts that God has in the coming movement will not be granted to them. The three gifts that God's going to give to the people that are going to take place in this work, to do the work in this place, he's going to give them inheritance. He's going to give them legacy. He's going to give them authority, but that will not be for them. And I personally believe that this is done. He approaches this because of their syncretism. Because remember, it's syncretism. It's the worship of Yahweh and other gods that got them into the exile in the first place. The whole reason they're having to come back and be in this situation is because of syncretism. And Nehemiah doesn't even address it. The king, he addresses them from this place because this place is what matters. Y'all have no inheritance. Y'all have no right. Y'all have no remembrance here because you don't honor the one true king. You're more concerned with this worldly king. But his response, Nehemiah's response, says, the God of the universe will make us successful. The King of the universe will make us successful. I think there's plenty that we could learn in this chapter. I think it's packed with a lot of stuff here. But I want to share three things that I think just stuck out to me that I think are very important for us to learn. I think from the beginning of this chapter, we learned that it's okay that we can have faith and still have human fear. Sometimes I think we have this inclination that if anybody has any type of fear or apprehension or anxiety, that they're not walking with God or not in step with God. But here, we see that Nehemiah still had fear of the king, even in his faith. We still have the instruction, do not fear. God tells us all throughout his word, do not fear. That is an instruction. But I think that fear is still very real and still very present in our lives at different times. But I think what's most important is that Nehemiah's faith pushed him through his fear. His prayer and acknowledgement of God's good hand is what carried him through the fear. That's what's most important. So when we see people that are suffering or are struggling with fear of something or anxiety, it's not so much that we should say that they shouldn't have it or they don't have enough faith that they have any fear, but that we should point them to passages like this, where the faith of Nehemiah is what got him through his fear. I think that we also learn that approaching others requires humility and discernment. This is really important. This is actually a godly thing. It's something that people try to teach in business classes and self-help books all the time, but this is godly wisdom. Nehemiah seems to know that mentioning Jerusalem by name would offend the king. Like, it is starkly obvious that he is intentionally not mentioning the name Jerusalem to the king in his appeal. He knows that he needs to have all of his data and facts straight before he approaches the Jewish officials, nobles, and priests. He knows that he can't just show up and say, I'm here to take over and to do all of this stuff to the city. He knows that he has to approach them a different way, and then he also knows that he has to humble himself with his opposition. What is our response if we'd have been in his situation? I'll tell you what my response would be. If they told me, like, are you here going to rebel against the king? I would pull out my receipts and say, bet. The king sent me. But that's not what he does. He redirected their opposition to the real issue of their faith. He knew how to approach them differently. I think that it's a story here where we need to really pray about true humility and discernment as we have relationships all around us. And thirdly, I think that we should always acknowledge God's good hand that's with us continuously. That seems like an obvious one, but if it's obvious, why does it have to be mentioned so many times in this chapter? When we have favor, we should remember that it's not us who got the favor, but it's the good hand of God who allowed us to have favor. It's the good hand of God that moves on us that allows us to have favor. That it's the good hand of God that moves on us, and that we should expect opposition in response. Like, how many times do we get upset when something good happens and immediately there's an opposition to that goodness, and we get so upset and bent out of shape about it? I'm guilty. Like, man, things were going great. I thought, God, man, why did this have to happen? That shouldn't be my response. I should expect it. It should be expected. We should be cool as a cucumber like Nehemiah. We don't have to respond to every single thing. We don't have to respond to every single bit of opposition. It's okay for someone to bring something to us and us not even to address it. I think the good hand of God should remind us all to persevere. That good hand of God that's with us through those fearful times or those tough times or those times of opposition. And I think ultimately the good hand of God should lead us to instill good in others. Because when we see the opposition here, it's so absurd, it's ludicrous that they would say that they oppose someone coming to instill good in any people. It doesn't even have to be the Israelites. Anybody who wants to instill good in others. If we oppose that, are we really allowing the good hand of God to lead us? So I'm going to pray, and I would encourage you today that if you have, they're going to come up and worship, but I know I can speak on behalf of Lawrence, that you can wait till after their song is done, or you can even come up if God moves you, and they'll sing a little quieter, and y'all can testify of something that God has done. I would love to hear at least one testimony of God's good hand in one of your lives. I think I shared last week, I don't know if I shared here or last Sunday about, did I share? I'm not going to say it again if I shared it last week. I know I did on Sunday. I don't know if I did this week about the guy from a training course years ago that called me. Did I share that story? He called me asking me about a Hebrew word. Did I share that here? Nope. All right, I'll share it. This will be my testimony. And I know I shared it on Sunday, but I wasn't sure about here on Sabbath. But last week, I guess, not this past week, but the week before, I got a text message from a guy, and I had his number saved in my phone, and when I would go to military schools, I'd always save their name, and then in parentheses, I'd put what school it is. So if I ever need to reach back out to them, I could search for that school name in my phone and find somebody that I could ask a question for. And so I got a text message from this guy, and he said something along the lines of, hey, if you have time this morning, I have a question about a Hebrew word that I think that you could help me with, but I understand if you don't have time. And for a split second, like all the thoughts of who this is was running through my mind. So I was in a class with this guy either 5 or 6 years ago, haven't heard from him since, haven't talked to him since. And in the class, he and I were the highest ranking guys, so they kind of put us in the leadership roles of the course. And one thing was clear. I was very open and willing to talk about my faith, and he had none. He was not a believer. But he had lots of questions. And we talked for, I think that course was 5 weeks. We talked for 5 weeks every day. He would ask question after question after question. And it was never like in this antagonistic way where I've had questions or conversations with atheists before where they would, it's kind of antagonistic. They want to prove you wrong. That was not the case here. He had genuine questions. And some of those questions, I would we would talk about it, and afterwards he would say, I've never had anyone say anything like this in response to this question. And then we left the course and literally haven't spoken to him since, and he texts me this. And so all this is running through my head because I'm greatly confused. I'm like, hang on, here's this guy who wasn't a believer, and I'm getting a text message about a Hebrew word in his Bible study. And so my response was absolutely, and he called me, and we talked for about 30, 45 minutes. And so he answered the phone. He's like, man, I'm so glad you took my call. I guess we were connected on social media, but I didn't even know that. And so he's like, I follow your stuff all the time. I knew you'd probably be able to answer this question. And I said, well, hang on. Before we even get to this question that you have, I said, I'm greatly confused. I need to know the story of what's happened since the last time we talked. And he kind of chuckled. He said, I figured you'd ask. And he said, I'll just say this. He said, for me, ashamedly, I prayed for that guy for probably about a month afterwards, and then I hadn't prayed for him since. But he said, for the next year after that course, he was like, I couldn't stop thinking about all our conversations. He said, I could not even think about any of the material we learned in the course, but I think I had divine memory to remember every single word that we said for those 5 weeks. He said, I couldn't shake it. I couldn't shake it. He said, about a year later, I gave my life to the Lord. And so he's been studying. And he said, I've even gone like I'm like really feel like I'm growing and studying and seeking. And he said, so I have this question about this Hebrew word. And I said, what's the word? He was asking about the word hate in the Old Testament. Now, if you remember, I went through the series on emotions here last year, I think it was, or earlier this year. But I'm going through that series on Sunday with the Baptist church. And I just laughed. I said, you'll never believe this. I said, I just preached on this very word and this very topic this past Sunday. I said, I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to send you the notes from the sermon so you'll have them and you can look over them again. So I sent him the notes because I keep all my notes like in Apple Notes. That's what I write my sermons in. And I sent it to him. He pulled it up and we just talked through it. And he was like, this is so great. I said, what's even greater is that this moment was meant to happen right now. And I thought about Nehemiah chapter 1, because when Nehemiah's brother comes, he could have just welcomed him and said, come on, let's go eat, let's have a good time, haven't seen you in a while. But before any of that, he asked him, wait a minute, what's going on back in the homeland? And I thought about that moment when he called, and I said, hang on, before we get to all this, tell me what happened between now and the last time I heard you. And so it was encouraging to me because, and I hope it encourages you, because I think over my career, I wasn't a believer my whole career in the Army, but most of my career I was. I can count 4 people where this has happened, where later on, after some school or some type of thing that I was with someone, 4 people called me back and said, I just want you to know that God used our conversations to bring me to the Lord. And I really think, how many opportunities, how many people don't tell us. And I think that it's really encouraging because sometimes we get discouraged. We can think, man, I'm pouring into these people at work. I'm pouring into my friends. I'm pouring into this person for years and years. And sometimes we never get any answers. And I probably wouldn't have gotten that answer today if I wouldn't have said, hang on, wait a minute. I want to hear what's happened since. So it was just encouraging for me, and I hope it encourages you that the work you do goes on and on. Because if we were in that course 5 years ago, I've gone 4 years not knowing that God's good hand had led me to have those conversations. So that's my testimony that I hope inspires you to share yours today. And the worship group will come up and we'll pray. If you need prayer, you can pray with your neighbor or you can come up for prayer. And if you have a word for us to hear, to be encouraged by, about the good hand of God, I really encourage it today. Father, we come before you and we give you thanks. We thank you for the opportunity to worship you, to come and glorify your name, to give you honor and respect and give you all the love that you deserve. And we thank you that you've given us a place to do so freely, that we can come and have a place of worship. We thank you that you've gone before us in so many ways, that you've provided a way and so many opportunities, and that you've led our path on so many trails that have led us to the places that you would want us to be. I thank you so much that you've led the people here to come to this place and to gather together, and that you've given us your word that we could be encouraged by the stories like the story of Nehemiah, that we could be encouraged that in times of fear and opposition that we can stand firm in our faith and prayer, and that your good hand will guide us and give us provision in the way that you seem fit. I thank you that you've given us your word in a time where we can read your word ourselves, that we can read it daily, and that you can speak to us continuously. We thank you that you've provided an opportunity for us in the kingdom through your Son, Yeshua, that we can have the freedom to live through the Spirit and to engage with others and to show them your good hand. I pray that you lead, guide, and direct us this week, that others would see your good hand through the work that you do in us, that they wouldn't see us, but that they would see you through us, that your light would shine and that it wouldn't be us, but we would only be there to give you glory for the things that happen. We love you, we bless you, and we give you thanks. Amen.